It's always good to be with everyone. Apologies for those who would have come in person today. We will hopefully be back to our regular in-person and on Zoom next week. This week it's not sickness in the house, but I have a flat tire and my car is just sitting there. It turns out these newish cars, and mine's not so new, 4 years old, but don't have spares in them anymore. They now have like this goo, and I don't know. We'll figure it out. Okay. Welcome back to the story of us. I've been thinking, there's actually a line from a Leonard Cohen song that's been reverberating around my head about the little Jew who wrote the Bible. Does anyone know this phrase or know this song? I'm even blanking on the name of the song that it's in. It's a throwaway line. But it really strikes me that that is what we are doing. And what we have been doing is we are going backwards and we are looking at these pieces of literature as windows into the world of the people who wrote the Bible, which is to say our ancestors and spiritual ancestors, right? These don't have to be literal ancestors. And that's a fundamentally different a fundamentally different project than the project of telling the story of Abraham and Sarah and their descendants. So we're really going to zoom in on that today. We're gonna try to take some of the literature of the moment we've been looking at, this moment right after the Babylonian exile, as a worldview, or as a window into the worldview of these folks. I'm gonna click a button so I'm not looking at myself. For those who don't know, by the way, if you click the three little dots in the corner of your own picture, you can make your picture disappear, which I don't know about you, I go a little crazy staring at myself the whole time. Does something to my brain. So anyways, good to be just looking at your faces again now. Okay. Did that make sense?
Daniel?
Yeah.
Actually, before you start, we have one person in the Zoom room at CRC.
Hello, hello.
And your name?
Leslie Hoffman.
Hey, Leslie.
Hi.
I'm going to leave her with the tablet and go back to the office.
Great. Thanks, Becky. Okay. So before we do our quick review of where we are at in history, any thoughts, any lingering questions or ideas from last week, or even from what I just said a moment ago, or anything standing there?
Well, for the new person, let's introduce ourselves.
Welcome, Leslie.
Hi, Leslie.
Okay. So let's place ourselves in history.
Okay, now you can speak.
Daniel,
Yeah.
would you feel it appropriate to share Mirakeket Kokavim with the group?
Please.
The story of us right now.
What are you... Say more.
The song I sent you?
The song, yes. Let's play it at the end.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Great. Yep. This will be perfect. We'll put it on at the end. Okay. So let's locate ourselves in time and in space once again. So we won't tell the whole story, but instead we're going to go back to that moment of King Josiah. So we're going to go back to about 620 BCE. And we've zoomed in on Josiah, but really the view that we need to be thinking about is that this is a moment when the power vacuum of the Assyrian Empire has been created. The Assyrian Empire has collapsed at this point. And it hasn't yet been reconstituted fully as the Babylonian Empire. And so for the very first time, there is a level of independence that Israel, Judea, that this kingdom, whatever we're calling it, has, that it really never had before. we have all these stories of King David in those glory days, but we know from archaeological records that the time period of David, Jerusalem was really a little backwater town. And this area was basically a backwater area whose importance was really just that it was a necessary place to conquer when Egypt and Assyria would go to war with each other. That was really the importance of this region, is that when the two great powers wanted to go to war, they had to trample over us in order to do so. So there's this power vacuum. And into that vacuum in the 620s emerges King Josiah's era of leadership. Right, he comes to power as a kid, but this is a moment when Jerusalem becomes a central capital, really for the first time, when it becomes something approaching a metropolitan population. I've seen estimates that say Jerusalem may have had 10,000 people at that time, which is quite a few people. The entirety of the kingdom of Josiah probably was around 100,000 human beings, which was a pretty good number for this era in terms of size. So this is that power vacuum, and it doesn't last long. Because very quickly Babylon comes to power. It resumes these wars against the south, against Egypt, and we once again sort of end up as a pawn in these battles. So the Babylonians come through, they capture this area, they cart off the leadership, call it the 10%, the educated 10%, to their capital cities. These are the scribes, these are the connected. These are the landowning class and the educated class and the head priests and the storytellers, the culture holders, and they're carted off into exile. By the time all is said and done with the Babylonian wars, with the Babylonian invasion, with the disease that ran rampant afterwards. By the way, I should note that in Babylonian records, we get one line about all of this. They conquered the kingdom of Judea. It went easily. Right? That's sort of all that was noteworthy about from the Babylonian perspective. We were just one of many other small kingdoms. But by the time it's all said and done, that population of around 100,000 is down to about 30,000 at the most. And Jerusalem has been just absolutely destroyed and does not meaningfully exist in the aftermath of the war, and even 100 years later is probably still only 2,000 to 3,000 people in Jerusalem, just a shadow of what it had been beforehand. However, over in Babylon, the well-to-do who were taken off as slaves very quickly after an adjustment period become really a part of the elite of Babylonian society. We talked about this last week when we were discussing this, but right, it was a general policy of the kingdoms and the empires that were conquering to treat the conquered nobility well, with the knowledge that you too soon could be the conquered nobility. So, just you do whatever you want with the commoners, but the nobility would be rather nice with each other, knowing that they too could be on the other end of that soon. So that's what we're talking about with this Jewish 10%, or the 10% of the Judeans who had ended up in Babylon. And as we talked about last week, that phrase Jewish, for the very first time, can be applied, I think, to those Judeans living in Babylon. Because for the first time, they figured out a way to do Jewish. I don't mean that as a religious statement. I mean that as a cultural, tribal, ethnic, identity-encompassing totality statement. They figured out a way to do Jewish not in Judea, to carry our civilization with us, which I think is the most distinctive part of Jewish civilization. Right, is that we have relocated as a people who for most of our history have not had a homeland. We've relocated our civilization from place to text. And that's what these folks did. They're the ones who began really telling the story of the Torah as we know it today. They're the ones who eventually write down the Torah in the version that we have as they leave from Babylon. And I should say, as long as we're talking about the they by and large stay in Babylon. Even as the Persians come to power, and this is what we talked about last week, even as the Persians replace the Babylonians as the head of this kingdom, of this empire, and Jews are allowed to return, by and large, almost all of us stayed. Those who came back as tools of Persian control, as tools of the Persian Empire. And so the writing of the Torah into an official version was almost certainly because it was demanded by the Persian Empire that we have an official version. The rebuilding of the temple and the centralization of Judean life around the temple in Jerusalem was very much a centralization driven by Persian power. We looked at this as a moment of increasing theocracy, maybe sort of the most extreme example of theocracy that we've seen. Maybe, I'm going to have to think about this, but I think maybe this may be the most theocratic Jewish regime in history that we're seeing at this moment, because it is priestly obsessed people who are connected with the Persians. It is purity obsessed people connected with the Persians. It's Ezra and Nehemiah. And so we looked at some of their texts. We looked at some of their story last week. Okay. The last note I'll say as catch-up, or as repetition from last week, is that these folks bring back with them things that today it's impossible to imagine Jewish culture, in particular Jewish religious culture, without. They bring back the idea of monotheism. They bring back the idea of, and a focus on afterlife. Anything dealing sort of duality of light and dark and Armageddon and a lot of these theologies which today we associate with Christian thought rather than Jewish thought, these are brought back from the encounter with the Babylonians. We bring back the calendar, right? So I mentioned that the war on the Judeans only gets a sentence in Babylonian history, but in that sentence it mentions that it happened in the month of Adar, and that's because we took the Babylonian months and made them our own. By the way, this is one of the best examples that we have of showing that the Torah as we know it is a product of post-exilic Jews, is that we have those same months. We even took the Aleph Bet, because the lettering that we think of as the Hebrew alphabet is in fact the Aramaic alphabet that we took back from the Zoroastrians, or took back from the Babylonians. Okay, that's the background. John, I see a question.
Yeah, put the time frame here. What you just said when they returned back to Jerusalem was about what date?
Yeah, so 586 BCE is the date we use for the destruction of the temple, which is to say the pinnacle of the Babylonian invasion.
Say that again, please.
586 BCE is the Babylonian destruction, the destruction of the temple. And look, again, this is one of the themes I keep repeating. I really think one of the problems with the way that we learn Jewish history is that it's mostly rabbis who teach it. So they overemphasize the religious parts of Jewish culture. And this is a great example right here. The temple is destroyed in 586, but that wasn't what was traumatic. What was traumatic was that everyone's homes were destroyed, and there was mass murder, and there was rape as a tool of war, and right, it was the total destruction of a civilization. And so when we say the temple was destroyed, you should hear White House down, that it's sort of just the symbolic moment of destruction. So that's 586, and about 60 to 80 years later, Jews start being able to return from Babylon, or from Persia at that point, Persian-controlled Babylon. So it's not long. It's long enough that there are generations born in Babylon. It's long enough that most of the folks there choose to stay. It's long enough that we see the successive generations of immigrants. Look at Jewish immigrants to the United States and the names of each generation. And you can see the conventions, right? The moments when folks generationally were trying to assimilate, and the moments when folks generationally were trying to show their Jewish distinctiveness. And we see the same thing in Babylon. That by the time Jews are allowed to come back from Babylon, we have gone through periods of taking Babylonian names and then periods again of Hebrew names. So, Paul, I'm just going to go ahead and mute you there. So that's sort of the medium length answer to that question. Larry. Oop, you got to unmute yourself though. There you go.
Yeah. How was the experience of the other kingdoms who were conquered by the Babylonians in the same period similar or different from the experience of Judea?
I think it's fair to say that our experience was not exceptional outside of the durability of our cultural identification. That Judean exile to Babylon doesn't look that different from Hittite or Moabite or any of the surrounding Canaanite or Phoenician or and I could be totally off base about when those particular cultures and areas and Edom and but the equivalent of them, it looks very similar to the Judeans. And again, I really think we can point to the writing of the Torah and the teaching of the Torah and just the notion that the study of Torah became a central Jewish act as being what this was about, along with, of course, the centralization of the Exodus story, which is incredibly inspiring when you're in that sort of situation. Thanks, Larry. Steve.
Can you identify anything that we absorbed from other elites who had been carted off to Babylonia?
Yeah.
I mean, are there things in the Torah or otherwise that we picked up from some of the other folks who got carted in?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm sure the answer is yes, overwhelmingly yes, and the answer is no. We can't identify any of those things. That what we can see is, and I should pause. Scholars of ancient Babylon may be able to identify some of those things, but that is certainly, no one has accused me of being that. But what we do see is that there's this brain drain, right? And this connects your two questions, yours and Larry's, that profoundly what's happening to Judeans is happening to all of the little areas around this and all of the peoples. And so we see the intellectual elites of everyone concentrated in Babylon and in these capital cities. And so I think that actually can't be overstated in terms of its importance, right? I don't think it's an accident that you get really advanced calendaring systems and mathematics and notions of agriculture and public health and all of these sort of remarkable things that come out of the Babylonian moment. You could maybe even point to monotheism as an emergence, as an idea, as an intellectual idea from this moment. Sarah's saying that she's having an inconsistent feed. Are other folks, is anyone having trouble hearing me? No? Sarah, I think it's you. I'm sorry. So that's what I would say, is that this is a cultural melting pot, and that is probably actually the magic of this moment. By the way, there's a story in the Hebrew Bible set in this moment, not written during this moment probably, but set in this moment. Anyone know what book we're talking about? This is the book of Esther. It's the story of Purim. That's set during this Persian period right here. Again, it's the story of Purim, and the book of Esther itself is very much a piece of literature, in a concrete piece of literature, and we'll look at it at some point. But we should not see it as history. You should tell us, and then Ken Goldman.
If things are doing so well for those elites who were carted away to Babylon, what precipitated just a small percentage of them going back? Do you have any feeling or knowledge?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question. The real answer is probably politics. I mean, certainly there were some people who would have ideologically wanted to return. I imagine that is the case. And again, with things like the emergence of Hebrew names in those later generations in Babylon, we can see signs of sort of that Jewish nationalism, Jewish pride, I'm not sure what exactly the right word is there. But really, they're going back because they're the most politically connected. Ezra and Nehemiah are being sent by the Persian Empire as agents of the Persian Empire to oversee the province of Yehud, which is the Persian province of Judea, Yehudah. So that's probably the answer there. Is something like that. It almost always is, right? And we like to tell a story after the fact that suggests that we have more power and control, right? We returned from Babylon, but it's only a small group of folks who actually chose to go. In that sense, it's probably not that different from the fact that very few people from Eastern Europe, Jews from Eastern Europe in the early 1900s, chose to go to Israel, to Palestine, British Mandate Palestine. I didn't mean that in a political way, though there's no saying these words without it being in a political way, until after the United States shut off immigration, right? We tend to teach that history as being people had Zionist ideological, but it's really just Jews started going to British Mandate Palestine once they didn't have a choice to come to America. But again, that's 3 months from now in the story of us that we'll get there. Okay, thanks. You should tell us, Ken.
I have a question about the Babylonian Talmud. You hear that referred to frequently. And was that written by those left in Babylon, or was it they wrote in a 7-year period and brought it back to Jerusalem?
Yeah, no. So the Babylonian Talmud is not written during this period at all. The Babylonian Talmud is written by many of the descendants of these folks who are still living in Babylon. So 586 BCE is when the Babylonians invade. By 450 or so, Jews are back in the Persian province of Yehud, running it in this sort of theocracy, and they write the Torah. The Babylonian Talmud doesn't really begin until after the year 200 CE. So we're really talking 600-700 years after this moment. But it's the same people or their descendants who do this. It is an unbroken culture of folks. And by the way, it continues to be an unbroken culture as we jump forward. The folks we call Mizrahi Jews, who are the largest population of Jews in Israel today, are the descendants of refugees who were the people who had lived in these regions since the Babylonian exile, which is just wild, but it's sort of really is history. Okay, Sarah, and then Steve again. This is good. We're getting questions. This is helpful, though, I think, to clarify some of these, and then we'll jump into Ecclesiastes.
So, when there was the return from Babylon, we know there was a small group of elites who went in doing this as a political gesture, to enforce the Babylonian hierarchy. But my question is, did they come with an army as well, or was there already a standing army, and then these folks were just sort of icing on the cake because they had some connection with the locals, or, were they kind of puppet people?
Yeah, great question. So the Babylonians destroyed society and then ruled over it as a province of their empire.
Okay, was this before the return?
This is before. This is before.
Okay, so then
Once
they ran
the
off with the top 10, the 10%. The 10%
They run off.
People who could read and write.
And then the Persians replaced the Babylonians as the heads of this empire. And the Persians have a different governing structure. They really emphasize local autonomy and allegiance with on-time taxes, I would say. Those are their priorities there.
Okay, so but was there an army concurrent with that coming from Persia?
So there's certainly armies, but the armies are focused on the Egyptian threat, not on occupation. And that's what's so distinctive here, is that the occupiers of Israel at this point are not the Persians. They're the Persian agents, Jewish agents of Persia, who are being sent back from Persian Babylonian exile to rule over these folks. And now, certainly there is the...
Cast themselves, sorry, so I'm just so I'm getting this right. So then they could cast themselves as protection against the Egyptians because they could say, I have, I'm from you guys, I'm the same stock.
Exactly.
My booby knew your booby, that kind of stuff.
Well, and by this point, it wasn't, no one there had a choice. The society had been destroyed, right? There were 100,000 people, and then there were, 20, 30,000 people, 10,000 people. You have very few folks left. You don't have much of a society or a civilization anymore, a lot of subsistence living. So it's just a different world that doesn't need military occupation at this point because it's mostly a destroyed land. And so they're coming to rule over and reestablish this region. For instance, and we talked about this last time as an aside, but Nehemiah immediately goes on the enormous construction project, expensive construction project of rebuilding the temple and building the walls of Jerusalem. And everyone freaks out at him because they're like, what are you spending this money on? We don't have food. So that's the sort of society we're seeing here. But really, the province of Yehud is an autonomous province of the Persian Empire. I don't push too hard on this example, Czechoslovakia to the USSR. A lot of local rule, a lot of, you still got a passport from there. I mean, clearly there's no such thing as passports, but right. But part of the empire and just another province, another state of the empire. This is not a military occupation. And I'm emphasizing this because Rome, when they come, is going to be a military occupation, and that is maybe the most distinctive, important piece you need to know in order to understand what happens there.
Okay, were the Greeks at the time that they came, were they also
Greeks come
military
next.
occupation?
Nope. Greeks are not a military occupation. They're a different model also, and they come next. But we'll get there in a week or two. Steve, you're muted.
Can you speak a little bit about the languages? How many different languages did these people have to learn? How many were they speaking? You talk about them taking Babylonian names. Did they also take the language and
So yeah.
What were they doing about Hebrew or Aramaic or whatever?
So Aramaic is
Learn another language when the Persians came?
Aramaic is the language of the Babylonian Empire. What Latin was to the Roman Empire, Aramaic is to the Babylonian Empire, and really to the Persian Empire as well. It's the lingua franca. So actually, this is the moment after the Babylonian invasion, 586 BCE, that Hebrew stops being the spoken language of the Jewish people. It is a wildly true historical quirk that Hebrew is not the spoken language of Jews or anyone from about 586 BCE until, 1930 or something. Yeah. No, I mean, right, it's wild. And now, there's 7 million, 8 million native Hebrew speakers. So yeah. Major linguistic shift, major everything shift after the Babylonian return. And again, Judaism is portable, and that lasts. Because all of a sudden, even though these folks have returned from Babylon, there is another Jewish center. And that's a radical thing.
What did the Persians speak?
Aramaic is the language that you get that is operating. There are going to be dozens or hundreds of languages throughout the empire. But Aramaic is going to be your lingua franca. And certainly within Israel, it becomes the main language. Now, Aramaic is also like saying, as far as I understand it, is like saying Romance languages more than it's like saying Latin. And there's a huge range of Aramaic. I know well enough to know that there's a big difference between Eastern and Western Aramaic, but then there's early, late, post-Persian, as you could imagine, right? We're talking thousands of years of history and linguistic development that's happening throughout here. Okay. We're caught up. That was a lot of catch up, a lot of questions, but I think that was good. I think it's important to clarify these things. Hopefully that was not too repetitive for folks, but in fact was clarifying. So we're going to look at my favorite. Let me check the time. Good, we've got a half hour. Perfect. We're going to look at my favorite book of the Hebrew Bible today. The book of Ecclesiastes, the book of Kohelet. Who here has read this book? Just to throw up your hands if you're... it's really wonderful. We're going to make our way. I bet we'll end up reading half of it today. It's very short. You could read it on your own in 20, 30 minutes. Existentialist crisis literature, maybe that's the way to think of the book of Ecclesiastes. We don't know much about its origins. It paints itself, and there's a long rabbinic tradition that sort of uses an interpretive lens here to say that it's written by King Solomon. Does anyone heard that it's written by King Solomon? He's Kohelet, the sort of author. And there's some reasons just in how the biography, the self-described biography of the author within the document that folks think that. We know for certain this was not written by King Solomon. There's a lot of reasons that we know that based on the ideas within it and when they emerge, but also just based on the language. There's lots of Persian loanwords that show up in here. Speaking of other languages other than Aramaic, we get lots of Persian loanwords, and we wouldn't have Persian loanwords during King Solomon's era. So almost certainly this is the product of this moment that we're in right now in the story of us. In the sort of 450s to 300 or so, in the time after we've returned from Persia, when we are a Persian autonomous region, before the rise of Alexander the Great and the Greek empires that replace all of this, and really sort of unify the great Northern Kingdom and the great Southern Kingdom. So we've looked at Deuteronomy and King Josiah, and you'll remember the distinctive thing we talked about with King Josiah and the books that were edited during his time period. As a reminder, Deuteronomy and Joshua and Judges and Kings and Samuel. I think I named all the ones. That there's this really distinct notion of reward and punishment for the observance or non-observance of the commandments. If you keep the commandments, and all you have to do is open up Deuteronomy and you'll find these verses. It's the middle paragraph of the traditional Shema, which is not in the CRC Siddur. It says, if you keep the commandments, the rain will come in its season and your kids will have enough to eat. And if you do not keep the commandments, then the rain will not come, your crops will wither and die, and your children will starve to death. Straight out of Deuteronomy. As a general rule, it appears that this was not understood as individual. It wasn't karma in any way, that it was collective, that the sins of the individuals could result in the punishment of the collective. This is really distinctive in Deuteronomy, and I know we talked about it when we looked at these texts. You don't find it in the other books of the Torah, but it is this dependent view of the world and of the relationship with God. So we looked at how this may have helped Jewish identity survive in exile. Because all of a sudden that view says that this is a God of history and not a God that loses battles, but that when we lose battles, it's because our God is punishing us, not because their God is stronger. And so this was a theology that in some ways served us in exile, even as it's deeply problematic and invested in self-blame and so on and so forth. But it's really important for us to understand that ancients were just like us in the sense that there is a huge multiplicity of views and theologies and values and understandings of the world. And many of us, I think, grew up with an image of the Bible being univocal, monovocal, that it is one document that speaks in one voice. What does the Bible say about, right? But the reality is the Bible is an anthology of ancient Jewish literature. That's what it is. And it's written, as we've seen, over hundreds and hundreds of years, and stories that probably exist across 1,000 years. by different authors in different moments with different political realities and different values and different understandings of the world. And sometimes those voices are directly speaking to each other. I want to suggest that Ecclesiastes, which we are about to look at, is very much a response to Deuteronomy and to the Deuteronomical thinking and to the sorts of thinkings that say that there are reasons why things happen. Ecclesiastes is a rejection of that. Okay, any thoughts on that? I'm going to still listen. I'm going to close my door that my dog just busted through so I can hear you all better. But if you have any thoughts or questions, yeah, please.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, Sarah.
Go through this whole holiday celebrating the gaining of the Torah. And there's this whole discussion, does it come down at one time, does it come down in parts, and blah, 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 and there's this whole, then we have Mishnah, and yell, and scream, and hand wave, but it's irrelevant because it's obviously not the story. I mean, it obviously comes down in chunks, it obviously is in, it's inspired differentially, so the whole, it's great we have the holiday, I'm glad we do.
So I'm gonna put a pin in that for a second because the holiday you're referring to is Shavuos, and let's just address this question quickly because I think this is helpful. Shavuot is one of the high holy days of ancient Judaism. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are like afterthoughts to the ancestors of this time period. The three high holy days are the three festival pilgrimage days of Shavuot, Sukkot, and Pesach, Passover. They're called the Shalosh Regalim, the three legs that hold up Judean religious life, not Jewish religious life, Judean religious life. Shavuot is a harvest holiday. It is only hundreds and hundreds of years after the time period we are talking about right now that Shavuot becomes associated with the giving of the Torah, which is to say that the story that you're talking about, Sarah, that associates the Torah as having come down at one time from Mount Sinai isn't a story that the people we're talking about in this historical moment would have understood because it only emerges as an idea, 500 years after this. I'm making that up right now. But was that helpful? Did I unroll some of those pieces there? And that, again, is the beauty of the story of us.
My only question was then, what was the meaning and purpose of this? But you said it was a harvest holiday.
The meaning and the purpose of the holiday is whatever meaning and purpose we give it today.
Fruits from the tree holiday. And we had the cows, the holiday surrounding the birthing of our Exodus and all of this.
But it's always, I guess what I'm saying is that the meaning of the holiday, and this is, again, I hope a big takeaway from the story of us as a whole, the meaning of any holiday or any text is whatever meaning we give it right here today. And all we're doing is going back and asking the question of what meaning did our ancestors give it in their moment, and what version of the story did they tell? Which is to say, the traditional idea of Shavuos as a holiday when the Torah is given is in fact a very newfangled idea itself.
Right. Okay, got it. I like arguing on Shavuot. I like eating.
And it's all newfound. It's exactly.
It's wonderful.
The Reformed Jews of 1,000 years ago.
Yak about things.
Okay, let's look at some text. So I'm going to pull up Trustee Safaria, as always. And let me do a screen share for y'all. And I apologize, people who are on the stream are not going to see the screen share. But if you go to safaria.org and click on Tanakh, everyone who's on Zoom is seeing this, right? Great. You go to safaria.org, you click on Tanakh, you scroll down to, where did you go, Ecclesiastes? Oh, here we go. Okay. And actually, you know what? I said I was going to do that, but let me give you a quick intro to Ecclesiastes even before that as a genre of literature. Ecclesiastes belongs to a genre that we find in the ancient Near East that is ancient. I mean, 1,000 years before this, we find examples of this genre known as wisdom literature. And what we mean by wisdom literature, you can really understand as hard-earned lessons that we are writing down for future people to know after we're dead. That's wisdom literature. And so Proverbs, Mishle, is probably one of the most famous books of wisdom literature that we know of today. And if you look at it, the book of Proverbs with all these sayings is given from the past. It is not given from God. It is not a divine book. It doesn't present itself as that. It's wisdom from the past. So generally, wisdom literature, ancient Near Eastern wisdom literature, is divided into two different categories. And again, this exists across cultures. This is not just a Judean thing. There is what's known as conservative wisdom literature, meaning the lessons from the past that we're passing down to you youngins who live in a more broken world than the more pure one that we grew up in. Which is, again, right, like these dynamics, generational dynamics have always been there in some ways, right? You see this forever. So that's conservative wisdom literature. The book of Proverbs belongs to what we call conservative wisdom literature. The other major category is cynical wisdom literature. In cynical wisdom literature, Ecclesiastes belongs to, and it tends to take the view that nothing lasts, so nothing much matters. Maybe it's not quite as simple as that, but that's sort of the carpe diem is often the view. Or what are the hold on, no, there's a new, and now it's even like dated. YOLO, you only live once. YOLO, that's right. Ecclesiastes is a YOLO document. You only live once. So Ecclesiastes very much belongs to the cynical wisdom literature genre. Again, it is my favorite book in the Tanakh. I hope that's not like a bad reflection on my personality. I think my brother would say it is, but you know. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and read. Is there someone who'd like to read for us? Someone up for it? Please, Jason, unmute, and I'll be interrupting quite a bit, but we're gonna try to make it through at least the first 2 or 3 chapters, and then the final chapter is what we're going to go through. So we'll have a lot here.
Is it Kohelet? Is it
Kohelet.
Kohelet. The words of Kohelet, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Utter futility, said Kohelet. Utter futility. All is futile.
Okay, so sometimes this word that's translated here as futility is translated instead as vanity. I think that's the word that you hear a lot here.
Yeah, vanity.
Vanity.
I've heard it is vanity, all is vanity.
And I'm changing our translation here, but the word itself is a word in Hebrew that also sort of has the sense of vapor escaping from, like when you open an oven and vapor pops out, something that is ephemeral, something that is temporary, something that doesn't have lasting value, is what I would say. Everything is compostable, maybe, is the idea here. Like, you give it enough times and worms are going to eat everything is the idea. Or eventually the sun's going to explode and envelop the earth and nothing will be left is the idea. Please keep going.
What real value is there for humankind in all the gains they make beneath the sun? One generation goes, another comes, but the earth remains the same forever. The sun rises and the sun sets and glides back to where it rises. Southward blowing, turning northward, ever turning blows the wind. On its rounds, the wind returns. All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place from which they flow, the streams flow back again. All such things are wearisome. No one can ever state them. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear enough of hearing. Only that shall happen that has happened. Only that occur that has occurred. There is nothing new beneath the sun.
Okay, let's pause. This is a text that we read, and this is the problem with so many of these biblical texts. You read them so often, and you hear them in cultural context, right? Think about how many cliches emerge just from this first chapter that are just cultural cornerstones, right? We're going to totally skip chapter 3, which is the bird song. To everything, turn, right? But what we see here, if we can get past, well, thoughts from you all. What do you see here? What is Kohelet saying? What does this first half of this chapter say? Yes,
A
sir.
lot of pithy declarative statements.
A lot of declarative statements, yeah. Sarah?
I was going to say that
Yep.
one of the things that we're seeing is the sort of idea that this too shall pass, you know? And I guess it was 2 weeks ago,
You cut out.
discussing, you know, the role, whether God was wrong or right in doing this horrible thing. And we had this, well, so what do we learn from it is the bottom line. So if this is all transient, what are we going to take away? What are we going to teach ourselves?
There you go. And that's, I'm going to put a pin in that because that's our next chapter, actually. Sarah Avery, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it sounds like he's saying all this has happened before and all this will happen again. Like you hear this a lot. I heard a lot of this when I was studying for my English degree in the Carpe Diem movement. They must have been reading a lot of Ecclesiastes.
I'm sure.
I think maybe he's saying, don't get too carried away with yourself because it doesn't mean much.
Yeah, good.
And you don't mean much.
You don't mean much. Not yeah, exactly. Okay, let's keep going.
Can I all that
Oh yeah, Elliot, please.
I would have to relook to see if applies to all the sentences, but some of them seem like they could be read either pessimistically or more optimistically.
Sure. Yeah.
You know, I hear Buddhism talks about a cycle and don't get attached to this because it all will change and then comes back and anyhow, yeah.
Let's read these next two verses because I think they'll bring some more cynical perspective. It's really. Steve, I see you're unmuted. Do you want to read for us?
Sure. You want me to read up here?
Please.
Sometimes there is a phenomenon of which they say, look, this one is new. It occurred long since in ages that went before us.
Don't get too excited here.
Huh?
Don't get too excited. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. The earlier ones are not remembered. So to those that will occur later will no more be remembered than those that will occur at the very end.
So
Koheleth was king in Jerusalem over Israel.
Okay, pausing again. Right. So this is this view, and we find it because we're not going to look at all the chapters, obviously. This is this view we find again and again in Kohelet, which seems to be an awareness that he doesn't know the names of his great-great-grandparents, is how I describe it. Right, it is this... I taught Kohelet actually to undergrads once, and I had a young student come up to me afterwards. Rabbi, I wish you had given us a warning about this before. Because, right, for some people, this is so dark, but that seems to be what Kohelet is realizing, is that it doesn't matter how important you think you are, or how wealthy you are, or how wise you are. You're going to die, and 6 generations from now, no one's going to remember anything but your name, and they'll only remember your name if you are particularly lucky, and a few generations after that, your name's going to be gone too. Toby.
that nothing really matters, that no matter what you do, it's not really important. So just don't worry about any of this.
Yeah,
It doesn't matter.
I think that's a part of it. And what I would say is, and we'll go through a little more text to get this, but I think Kohelet has come to that place and then is asking the question of now what? What do you do when you realize that we're not important and we don't really matter and that our existence is just a blink in the eye of the universe? What do you do then? And I'm not sure Kohelet has an answer, but okay, I'm going to take us through some of this because we only have 8 minutes left, and I want to put this away for today. So let me share this again here. Okay. I set my mind to study and to probe with wisdom all that happens under the sun, right? So he goes out and decides to study. I said to myself, here I have grown richer and wiser than anyone who ruled before me over Jerusalem. This is why he's sometimes associated with Solomon, even though this seems to be just a poetic tool here. And I've absorbed all of this wisdom and learning, and I set my mind to appraise wisdom and to appraise madness and folly, and I learned that this too was like the pursuit of wind. For as wisdom grows, vexation grows. To increase learning is to increase heartache. So Kohelet decides, okay, if I'm not going to, if the right path is not just learning, then let's go off and party hard. I said to myself, come, I will taste of merriment, taste of mirth. This too I found was futile. Of revelry, I said, it's mad. What good is, right? None of this lasts. He tries buying everything. He's the king. He can buy everything. Gardens and pools and none of it provides any meaning. It always leaves him wanting for more. Thus I gain more wealth than anyone before me, and this too was vanity. He goes on a whole reflection on how not only did he become wealthy, but then his children turned into spoiled brats because he was wealthy and they didn't even value the things that he learned to value. He comes to the conclusion that this too is futile. Because the wise, just like the foolish, are not remembered forever. For as the succeeding days roll by, both are forgotten. They both die. I'm trying to find the line where he talks about animals. This one always stands out to me. Here's your chapter on the birds, by the way, A Time for Everything. And it's right after this. Here it is. Where are you? I've lost it. There's this line in here here it is. So I decided in regards to human beings to disassociate them from the divine beings and to face the fact that they are animals. This is 2,500-year-old literature saying we are not like the angels, we're like the goats. For in respect to the fate of humans and the fate of animals, they have one and the same fate. As the one dies, so dies the other, and both have the same life breath. Humans have no superiority over animals since both amount to nothing. Both go to the same place, both come from the dust, and both return to dust. Who knows, and this seems to be the sort of afterlife theology of his moment, who knows if the life breath of humans does rise upward and if the breath of animals does sink down into the earth? I saw that there's nothing better for people than to enjoy their possessions, since that is their portion, for who can enable them to see what will happen afterwards? This is such an important voice to bring in, because we have this tendency to look at the people who wrote the Bible, to look at ancient Jews, ancient Judeans, to look at our ancestors and imagine that somehow they look like Orthodox Jews or the ancient version of that sort of faith. And people have always been people. And there has always been a complexity and a doubt and a cynicism that many of us have faced when we look out into the world, right? Kohelet is looking at everything around and saying, we have no idea if what these priests are doing has any real meaning or is just silliness. And he seems to be coming down on the side of silliness if he had to guess. It's wild, not that this book exists, but that this book was included in the Torah, or excuse me, in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, that this book was canonized. And I think the reason it ends up being canonized, and we're going to get in a few weeks to the period of the people who actually canonized the early rabbis, but I think the reason it was canonized is because in the same way that there is a human inclination towards the Deuteronomical view that wants there to be reasons why things happen, there is also this human thread, this Jewish thread that says, no, there's no reason or explanation. You can't understand any of this. Actually, my favorite way of saying this in just a sentence, it's part of the Christian scriptures, but almost certainly written by a Jew. It's in the Gospel of Matthew, is the rain falls on the just and the unjust alike. I love this line. But I think that's the view of Ecclesiastes. Or what's the bumper sticker? Shit happens, right? I mean, that's the view of Ecclesiastes. This is a view that says there are no comprehensible reasons for anything. Job falls into this same category of literature. Okay, now we are going to end by looking at the end of Ecclesiastes, because it was, I think we all have a sense of the message of this document. It was such a subversive document that even though it ends up being included, someone wrote an addendum that undermines the entire document and threw it onto the end of Ecclesiastes. And the version of Ecclesiastes we have today includes it, but you won't have trouble seeing it. Let's go all the way down. Actually, you know what? We'll read the whole last chapter, if only because I think, you know, we always read the birds one, chapter 3. I think this is the prettiest poem in here about aging and death. And so appreciate your vigor in the days of your youth, before those days of sorrow come and those years arrive of which you will say, I have no pleasure in them. Before sun and light and moon and stars grow dark and the clouds come back again after the rain. When the guards of the house become shaky and the soldiers are bent and the maids that grind, grown few, are idle. And the ladies that peer through the windows grow dim and the doors to the street are shut. When the noise of the handmill growing fainter and the song of the bird growing feebler and all the strains of music dying down. When one is afraid of heights and there is terror on the road, for the almond tree may blossom, the grasshopper be burdened, and the caper bush may bud again, but mortals set out for their eternal abode with mourners all around in the street. Before the silver cord snaps and the golden bowl crashes, the jar is shattered at the spring and the jug is smashed at the cistern, and the dust returns to the ground as it was, and the life breath returns to God who bestowed it. Utter futility, so said Kohelet. All is futile. So that should be the end of this document. Isn't that gorgeous, by the way? Do other people resonate with that as much as I do? I mean, I think it's the prettiest part of this whole book. And now we get the postscript from some later redactor who clearly really disliked Kohelet. And there's always some people, I assume some of us here also really disliked Kohelet. There are always people who don't like it. It's the same inclination. Do you like thinking about that picture of Earth, right, the pale blue dot, or does it give you the heebie-jeebies to imagine how tiny we are in a cold, enormous universe? So the people who got the heebie-jeebies added this and said, a further word. Because Kohelet was a sage, he continued to instruct the people. So he had a change of heart later in his age, it seems to be. He listened to and tested the soundness of many maxims. By the way, I just want to, you can see here that this was clearly not by the same author, right? It doesn't even pretend to be, even as later on rabbinic tradition says it is. Kohelet sought to discover useful sayings and recorded genuinely truthful sayings. The sayings of the wise are like goads, like nails fixed in prodding sticks. They were given by one shepherd. A further word. Against them, my son, be warned. The making of many books is without limit, and much study is wearing of the flesh, which seems to be a message of folks who are worried about the study of Greek philosophy by this time, and it leading to heresies amongst the youth. The sum of the matter, when all is said and done, revere God and observe the commandments, for this applies to all humankind. I can't think of a sentence that is less what Kohelet was saying. Kohelet was saying, who knows whether any of this is real, whether any of this religious stuff is just hocus pocus, and instead we should make sure to fill our lives as fully as we can, because once you're dead, you're dead. And at the end, they're so uncomfortable that they say, actually, the summary of Kohelet is revere God and observe all of the commandments. For this applies to all humankind, that God will call every creature to account for everything unknown, be it good or bad. And the rabbis are still uncomfortable with it and cause there to be a tradition that says that, in fact, you repeat that final line twice just to reinforce and undermine everything the Kohelet was saying. The sum of the matter, when all is said and done, revere God and observe the commandments, for this applies to all humankind. Okay. A little peek through the windows into the past, hopefully. I'm really hopeful that today added some complexity and some nuance and multivocality to our ancestors. I also hope it just keeps reminding us of how human our ancestors were. They had all of the same pains and problems, and this is Kohelet's message, that everyone falls in love for the first time, and every generation thinks they're the first ones to discover sex, and every generation thinks that they're going to revolutionize the world and every generation grows old, and that's Kohelet. Okay, closing thoughts or ideas or
Daniel,
yeah.
Tell us why this is your favorite book in the Bible.
Yeah, why this is my favorite book in the Bible. I see myself in this text. Rabbinically, I very much believe that Judaism and Jewish identity is of instrumental, not absolute value. That Judaism and Jewish identity can help us live and lead better lives, but that it doesn't inherently make anyone's life better. It only makes your life better if it makes your life better. It can also make your life worse. That it's not a goal into itself, and I think that's a very sort of Kohelet idea, but also just doubt and impermanence as Jewish values and mindset speaks to me. I also find it just comforting.
It's also beautifully written.
It's beautifully written, right? I don't know. I have always found it comforting that someday, this is weird, I know, that someday the sun will envelop the earth. Right? Like, okay, so then the mistake I just made maybe isn't as important. Yeah, Ray.
You have an old soul.
There you go. Okay. Oh, John, yeah, please.
I substitute teach at Clayton High School, and I'm there about every day, it seems like. But I was in a room where it showed the class pictures, and I was looking at a series of the school's class of 1924, of 1925, of 1926, and I sat there and I look at this just yesterday, and I was looking at it, and I'm thinking, here's all these 18-year-olds ready to go out into the world, live their life, and I'm looking at this, they've lived it, they've died, and what? So I guess it was kind of preparation.
It's a very Kohelet kind of moment, exactly. Yeah, right, that's the idea. That's exactly it.
And who knows them today? I mean...
That's Kohelet. Elliot.
Again, I'll want to look at the book more carefully, but I hear, potentially at least, echoes from other faiths as Buddhist impermanence. They'll meditate on skulls, and in Christianity, lay not up treasures where moth and rust doth corrupt. I mean, if you want to be famous, that ultimately becomes hollow for many people. I think so many of the values we pursue are hollow, and that if one lets go of those pursuits, perhaps that opens one to a deeper level of self that is of different character.
I think Kohelet and the Buddha would have had a good time together. Yeah.
I always take away sort of as a biologist, as an evolutionary biologist, this whole thing about changing and morphing and becoming, and I keep thinking every time somebody gets too full of themselves, when who died made you God, but more importantly, I think, we're all made of stardust and dinosaur piss. So what part are you stardust and what part are you dinosaur piss?
There you go. Kohelet. Maybe I don't mean to be judgy, Sarah. That might be a little less poetic than Kohelet, actually. It was.
Oh, certainly less.
Carol, and I'm aware that we are over time, but obviously folks can.
I'll talk fast.
No, I'm in no right, so folks can jump off when they need to.
This is bringing back a memory from being a geologist in one of my classes when I commented about one day. I said, well, maybe there's a landform, a tectonic move, and I said, maybe that's what's happened with the Red Sea, right? Sea spark and all that stuff. And my instructor looked at me and he said, Carol, I don't believe in religious phenomena. And I'm going, okay, then never mind, But it was that same, no matter how much progress we make scientifically, it's a case of, oh, who cares? So what? But I don't know. There's part of me that argues with that a bit, but there's part of me that argues with everything. So, but this brought that memory back of being right there in that classroom. And
that we, as Jews, it's more about what we do and not what we become or leave behind. It's sort of our immediate legacy of what we're doing. We always have to.
Yeah, and I think you can think of Kohelet in all wisdom literature at some level as being ethical wills left by the past to the future. Felice.
Unmute yourself, Felice.
I wonder if she accidentally put up the hand.
Hi, this is Annette.
Oh, we hear you, Annette. Go for it.
I find some levity in this. When people are so full of themselves, it makes me laugh
Yeah.
because of the universe and how small we are. To me, it's funny and levity and humor.
Yeah. I totally resonate with that. Yeah. Toby, and then Elliot.
It reminds me when I was younger, in the days when Sputnik and all this kind of stuff, and they were talking about the young people being the future of the country, and we were important, and we were going to change the world, and then Vietnam. But what happens is you narrow your focus about what you can change. And I view this as freeing to say, okay, if I can change the life of one kid or one person, who knows how in the circle and the pond it's going to end up. And if I don't know it, in the end, it really doesn't matter. It's making the life of someone better, no matter what the future is.
Nice. Elliot, then Helene.
Following along what Annette said about humor, this isn't the only attitude I take, but I like Stephen Gaskin's line, just a bunch of monkeys sitting on a big rock.
There you go. Helene.
I did read this when I was younger, and it didn't resonate. But now that I'm in my later years, and it's like every day seems to bring a phone call of somebody else who's ill. It makes great sense, and so I see why they would call it a wisdom literature. Because when I was young, I thought everything was endless, and I loved that line at the beginning that you read about our eyes cannot see enough and our ears can't hear enough. I mean, I just couldn't absorb enough of life. and now I can lay back and just enjoy watching it go by. I don't have to do everything and experience everything.
Nice. Amen. And really encourage folks to go back and read the whole book. It's not long, and it's beautiful. Nancy. Oop, you got to unmute though, Nancy. Oop, you had it. Yep, there you go.
So I was just going to say that one of the other things for me about Ecclesiastes is that I have a whole lot of trouble with the idea of retribution and of a religion that has the kind of payback that you were talking about earlier. And I think Ecclesiastes addresses that, so not so much.
Yeah. Ecclesiastes, Kohelet feels like I know he's classified as a cynic. I think of him as a sort of a realist who's just looking out in the world, and sort of not buying what's being sold at the temple. Yeah, Leslie.
This is reminding me, I think that there is a kind of a contemporary modality in psychology that I think it might be called the universal perspective theory, where, people who are struggling with the day should step back and take a look at this in their place in the universe and how small they are. And it's definitely something that I know that I've read about.
Nice. Yeah, right, that's Kohelet. I also, by the way, I think that's Mariv Aravim and Yotzer Or within the liturgy, I think is there to serve a very similar purpose. Okay, Elliot, last thought, and then we'll, Rudy gets to close us, as always, but Elliot, go ahead.
I see Kohelet as kind of offering a challenge, because if there is a kind of unsatisfactoriness about the things of the ego, then how do we deal with that? We can, and I think does take some people into a lot of depression. But I think there is another avenue. If you let go of the things of the ego, then what doors does that open?
Nice. Okay, Rudy.
What do you want me to draw or paint this week?
Something I feel like you should paint it and then we should burn it up. It should be like
What would you like me to paint?
I don't know. What's
merriment.
Merriment. Okay, merriment. I like it, Samantha.
Fullness of merriment.
Mary, what is that?
Joy. People having fun.
How about a person turning into dust?
Ooh. There we go.
So Rudy, where can we see these paintings and drawings? You keep promising them, but
You showed at the beginning. You got to get on early. That's you want the Rudy show. You got to get on early here. Avi says trees for Tu B'Shvat too. Yeah. Tomorrow night, by the way, join us for a adultish Tu B'Shvat evening at CRC.